I saw that 10 of our 12 had registered on iClicker. If you have, go ahead and log into that. We're going to give it a try today. If you haven't, please register as soon as possible. The link is in an announcement on Canvas. Okay, welcome back, everybody. 9 of our registered 12. Couple of announcements to get started. I'm gonna start Zoom recording. I already have. And that kind of reminds me that I think I was a little too vague about attendance. This is, we're all kind of adjusting to the weird ways we've been in the past. So let me be really super clear on attendance. We are in in-person mode at ASU. That means that more and more people are doing less and less Zoom. I think it also means that people are coming up with their own philosophies. And so you may have classes where you can Zoom a lot. You may have classes where people are, no, absolutely not. I'm so sick of that. I'm not doing that anymore. I don't know where I fall on that, except that I do like the recording of lectures on Zoom. And then I will provide you the link for them. And then I'm going to figure out a way to save them off the cloud because they like to delete them after a couple of months. But here's the lowdown. You have to be in person, or you have to be live for lecture to get credit for being in the class. This is a class where there's a lot of information. This is a core class in many of the majors. History tells me that if you're not in class, you are not going to survive. So you have to be live in class, and I hope that you'll be here in person because that's where we can talk and you can ask questions. You may contact me if you have COVID, if you have possible exposure to COVID, and I will then let you into the Zoom room so that you can be live in the Zoom room to get credit for being present for the lecture. That will be recorded by your responses, your live responses, when I put forth iClicker questions, which we are going to practice with this week. So please, if you came in late, hop on to iClicker on this course. And if you haven't registered yet, please do that as soon as possible. Next week, it will start counting against you if you're not participating in iClicker. So you can be on Zoom if you have a medically excused absence. If your car breaks down, if your girlfriend would like to go out with you at a time, the classes, these are not things that I want you to email me about and ask for allowance into the Zoom room. These are things that make you maybe decide, well, my girlfriend's more important to me than ecology lecture. And you know, you wouldn't be the first person to think that. You will have to start to juggle these things and go, well, I can go out with my girlfriend a lot of times. We're going to talk about population growth today, and I'm going to be sunk if I don't get exposed to that early on and repeatedly. So attendance is mandatory. You will lose participation points if you aren't here. If you have a medically related reason for not being here, and you can contact me, then I will let you in the Zoom room. I'm not going to be checking the chat. I'm not going to be creating exercises or breakout rooms. I hope we never have to go to back to that. I'm about to go to a conference online, and I'm dreading the breakout rooms and just the awkwardness of not knowing people. The social awkwardness that I have to begin with is compounded by being on a computer screen. Okay, so that is the Zoom/attendance part of things. I also want to point out that the schedule for the class has already changed, as I promised it would. I forgot that I'm going to the beach. I'm going to a conference that happens to be at the beach, almost on the beach, the Silmar Conference Center near Monterey, California. Is just one of the best places to go to a conference, because when the whole morning looks like boringness, you just get your coffee and you sneak out to the beach. This is how academics roll. I think we take our jobs pretty seriously, but we also like to play. So I'm going to the beach, and I'm going to miss 2 lectures in September. And I have arranged for 2 of our most interesting new faculty members that do work related to ecology to give you an introduction to what they do during those 2 sessions. The first, I think the Tuesday, is a plant ecologist that just joined us a year ago. Maria, I can't remember her last name, Dr. Maria, I can't remember her last name. And the second is Anthony Barley, who I just helped to get hired over the summer. A really cool young conservation biologist who studies evolution in whiptail lizards, who have just about the coolest system in the world. So I think you'll enjoy both of those talks. Please attend those, because I don't want to ask them. I might actually ask them to Zoom record it, so we can have a full, so that you can see those recordings, because the material from that will be on quizzes. But I don't want to ask them to be letting people into the Zoom room unless you know the day ahead of time, I got COVID and I really don't want to miss that. We can get it arranged, but otherwise it might be pretty tricky. to get them to accommodate that. So be prepared for that. That's going to set us back. That might mean that we have the exam 1 lecture later, 2 lectures later. My hope is that with the 75-minute format, I'm going to move more quickly through some material. That might be a naive hope. So that's the schedule, and that is announced on Canvas. So when you're trying to remember what's going on in the class, please remember that if you printed out the syllabus on day 1, it's probably changed, and Canvas is the history of how those things have come up in the class. Next announcement is the discussion board. I have something called week 1 and week 1 and 2 up there. Week 1 is this week, and we are going. I've given some examples of good and bad thread starters. You have until before class next Tuesday to get a thread starter going. I promised to give everybody a 10 out of 10 this week, as long as you put in a good effort and you get it in there in time, and I will give you feedback if I think that you're doing work that's not going to get you as many points as you need to use this as a help to your grade rather than a hindrance to your grade. Week 2 is then the following week, and what we're going to do is another gimme week where, as long as you do it in time, you will get credit. But here, you're not going to be starting a thread. You're going to be responding to one of the 11 other threads. Don't respond to your own thread. Respond to someone else's thread and try to keep the ball rolling. A lot of times, people put a lot of work into their own thread starter, and then the response is, "Dude, cool idea. I hadn't thought about it that way. I saw you wearing those sneakers in class the other day, and I thought those were awesome." Don't do that. Do something with ecology content. Agree or disagree, I don't care. If you disagree, make sure it's polite, but use the material, use your understanding of the material to try to add to the conversation that they've started. Sometimes it's easier to disagree. You could say, you know what, you're defining population ecology this way, but my understanding from the lecture was that population ecology involves this, that, and the other. That's learning. That's not being rude. That's using your confusion, which we all have learning material, to try to clear up confusion. And guess what? It actually clears up other people's confusion. And when there's a dialogue like that, I usually get in there and go, you know what? I think so-and-so has it right like this, but I think the response has it right like this. Let's find a happy ground, a happy understanding of the confusion. Okay, so get on there this week with a thread starter. Many of you already have. And then the following week, you'll have the week to do a response. And then just a heads up that weeks after that, you will be doing one or the other. 4 or 5 of you will be doing a thread starter, 5 or 6 of you, and the others will be assigned to respond, and then we'll flip-flop that. So that every week there's like 6 thread starters, plus any ones that I start. And if I start one, you're welcome to respond to that too. Don't feel intimidated. You'll feel free to disagree with me. Say, you know, the way you're presenting community ecology in this emphasizes this, but in class I heard it like this. Can you help me understand what community ecology really is? Okay, so be active on there. Don't send them in late. I don't do late for that. You know, you've got a whole week to do this. So things that come up the hour before it's due aren't really relevant because you could have done it, you know, 5 days earlier. So stay on top of things on Canvas. Okay, did attendance, I did schedule. So we're Zoom recording. We are going to start here in a second with a couple of iClicker questions just to see how that goes. Looks like. Why does this, so this says we have 11 in the class, but Canvas says we have 12 in the class. That's always a fun brain freeze when different formats think different things. Okay, well, this week is practice for iClicker anyway, so it'll all work out. Okay, I'm going to start here because this I told you was the most, let me actually share my screen. This is why. When I switch PowerPoints, I'll almost certainly forget to switch that. Okay, I told you this is probably the most important slide in the course, and that's just because it's a roadmap to the entire course. it has the levels of ecology that we will be covering to different degrees. Starting at the bottom, individual ecology, populations. Populations are groups of a species. So groups of individuals of the same species make up a population. There we'll study population growth, population shrinkage, different ways that populations grow. Then we'll move to competition equations. Members of the same species or population compete with each other. Some hog all the food. What does that do to population growth? Some share food. What does that do to population growth? Then we move up to more than one species. When two species are competing, that's called interspecific competition instead of intra-specific competition, right? A food resource is not eaten just by one species. It's often eaten by multiple species. So that will introduce species interactions. There we also have things like predation and mutualism and parasitism. Then we're going to talk about community ecology. This really emphasizes the diversity, not just two species going at it somehow, but instead the community of species. So we talk about diverse species diversity and biological diversity and community ecology. You'll notice this is all over here on the right, and this is kind of the organismal half of the course, or the half of ecology. This is individual organisms, individuals of the same species, two species, individual organisms of two species affecting each other. And this is kind of the big network of species all in each other's presence. Okay, so you might have a species diversity of 290, or you might have a species diversity of 29. I think that kind of suggests some big differences in the ecology. When we shift over to the more abiotic or systems level side of ecology, we'll start talking about ecosystem ecology. Ecosystems and communities are oftentimes mixed up by students. This is kind of the community biological organization. This is kind of the same community level, but we're now talking about the less organismal aspects. What is the soil type? What is the fire regime? What's the, I mean, we do talk about plant diversity over here because plants affect everything. They affect the soil, but these two are very similar. It's just that this is the start of the abiotic and this is the end of the biotic. From the ecosystem, you go up to how ecosystems connect, and that's landscape ecology. Then the regional ecology of what's it like? What's the geographic ecology? You might say, what's the species diversity in North America? And boom, you would have kind of connected community ecology with regional ecology, talking about a certain region. This gets into the spatial differences in ecology. And then last, the globe. Talk about how so many pressing issues are at the level of global ecology. Very, very hard to study globes because you can't really replicate a globe. We have one, and we don't want to kill it, but it's hard to know what we're doing to it. Okay, so that was a little bit of a review. We went through Russ, poison oak, the genus for poison oak and poison ivy. We talked about how it integrates lots of levels of ecology. And so this takes us to here. I'm going to hit you with three, I think, very straightforward poll questions. Doesn't matter if you get them right, but you will find out what the answer is. So let's give you 30 seconds to answer the first poll. Which is the broadest level of ecology? Oh, sure, capture the whole screen. Yeah, that looks like it's captured the right thing. Which is the broadest level of ecology? What did we say was narrow? What did we say was broad? Individual, ecosystem, population, or species interaction? Which one of those is the broadest level of ecology that we could study? It's like we got most of our responses in. Give you 5 more seconds. I'll usually give you a 5-second warning. Make sure you get an answer in so you get credit for it. And we have perfect scores of ecosystem ecology. And hopefully you could go back and explain to me, well, why is ecosystem broader than individual? Well, duh. Why is ecosystem broader than population? Why is it broader than species interaction? It's broader because it's not talking about just those species of the members of that species. It's talking about the entire kind of playing field. Maybe that's a good analogy for the ecosystem. It's the playing field that the teams are playing on. All right, let's stop that one. And let's do a new one with this question. Which is the narrowest? Community, ecosystem, population, species interaction. Okay, 10 more seconds. Let's get everybody on there. If you're not on iClicker, you should be like answering this in your head to make sure you get it so that you can see if you're working in the right direction. Cut you off. And every single person picked a population, you know, individual population, species interaction, community, ecosystem, landscape, region, and global or biosphere. So looks like everybody's on the right page there. There will be questions this easy on the exam. There will be questions not this easy on the exam. Maybe this is an example. The next one, one more just to get everybody registered here. Which level of ecology was not involved in the Russ or Poison Oak lecture example? Which one was not involved? Even though we might have said we could try to make every single level involved, which did the case study not treat or address? Okay, a little bit tougher. People are slower getting their answer in there. Take 5 more seconds to take a guess at it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Survey says, okay, we're a little bit more split. So the majority of people said ecosystem, and that is the correct answer. Some people said individual, but if you go back to your notes, you're going to see it talked about the plant physiology that underlies the individual plant and its production of this toxin. It certainly talked about population growth, talked about the global ecology of CO2 levels affecting the population issue of population growth. And there was a species interaction in there as well, because it was talking about the fungus that is the actual thing that poison oak is trying to defend itself against, being a part of this whole messy situation. So D might be one that you're like, oh, I don't really remember how it was too pertinent to species interaction. But I think the best answer is ecosystem, because we never talked about, let's try to come up with an ecosystem level issue. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus levels in the soil of where these plants exist affect population growth, affect the level of the toxin. If we could talk something about that playing field, about the nutrients, about the abiotic features, we could talk about rainfall. You could take it as just as simple as saying, well, climate change isn't just temperatures changing, it's also pulses of precipitation changing. So rainfall, while we oftentimes think of as global, is also an ecosystem level thing. Our ecosystem right now is getting hit with a totally different rainfall pattern than it did the last 10 years. I didn't know what a monsoon was until the last couple of years, because my first few years here were monsoon-less. So something about that playing field, soil, nutrients, something that's not living, that's going to implicate the ecosystem level. It's a pretty good question, because it is abiotic. That's why some people just like to call everything on the left systems ecology, because when you break it down, really what all the left side is doing is breaking abiotic systems ecology into chunks of space. Talking about the small playing field, it's talking about how playing fields are connected by landscape ecology, and then it's talking about how the playing field could be one continent, and then it's talking about how the playing field is one globe. So in some ways, systems ecology is easier to think about because it's the same abiotic issues, just at different scale. The right side is just fundamental. Of course, I think the right side is more interesting because it's where I work. It's fundamentally different types of questions, focusing on cells or genes, focusing on the group that is a population, focusing on how species interact. It's asking questions at different levels of organismal ecology, whereas systems ecology is simply kind of different sized scaled questions. It's a very, very good question, though. I mean, that's the kind of confusion that you'd have the night before the exam and go, CO2 is abiotic. Why is it not a part of the ecosystem? And the answer is it's a scale issue. You could say CO2 levels in the soil are an issue of ecosystem ecology. And I think that you would be right and justified, because if you're talking about the soil CO2 levels, you're not talking about global atmosphere and circulation. So if you can pin CO2 down at the scale of the ecosystem, then CO2 is an ecosystem level question. If you're talking about CO2 at the level of a continent or a patch near the ocean versus a patch away from the ocean, then that's more of landscape ecology. Then the last thing I'll say is that these things are impossible to draw solid lines around. And my questions will hopefully not be challenging in a confusing way, but instead will just see if you understand the broad strokes of these differences. I'm not going to try to find the weeds in between, where does population ecology start and stop, and where does species interactions. My favorite is cannibalism. One of my favorite things to study. That is a population, that is a within species thing, right? That's cannibalism of your species. But it's not a species interaction, but it's a predator-prey event. The individual that's eaten is consumed by the predator. So it's predator-prey, but it's population. I would never put that on an exam and watch you dangle, because it's a subtle, nuanced thing. I'm going to be asking more easier questions. I like it. All right, go away. Now let me go. All right. The rest of this first lecture are a couple of examples of applications of ecology. And the first, maybe this isn't the first. Yes, this is the first. Simply conservation biology. I told you about Anthony Barley. We targeted him. We were looking for someone that does conservation, because we know recently our students, we have a lot of environmental science students, but some of them, maybe some of you included, are more interested in the conservation of biodiversity than they are environmental health sciences, pollutants in waterways, air pollution. Those are both very important things, but the organismal side of environmental science was lacking in our school, I thought. So I put forth the idea we have to hire a conservation, preferably ecologist, preferably somebody that studies modern techniques in genes. That's exactly what we got in Anthony Barley, a conservation biologist using ecology and evolution and genetics to study the persistence of species. So there's a lot of examples of ways that ecology feeds conservation biology. When we study the behavioral ecology of species, this is actually my discipline, behavioral ecology. It falls under individual ecology. I won't be lecturing on behavioral ecology because there's a whole course in behavioral ecology. But the study of behavioral ecology, a part of ecology, understanding how species communicate, how they migrate, how they move through lanes where there's human traffic. This can help us understand the conservation of species. And we know that there are whale species who are incredibly limited by their demographics, by their migration behavior, and conservation biology and population ecology help us understand that. Studying how the population is growing, and demography just means like kind of age groups. The idea that moms usually have one calf every 3 to 4 years. It takes this many years for them to become reproductive. And in whales, it takes a long time for a baby to become somebody that can have babies. This is demography. In the same way you might have heard of human demography, like how many conservatives, how many Republicans, how many people under the age of 30, how many people with internet. That's human demographics. Ecological demographics is about the things that affect biological success. Okay, and life tables are just a fancy way to graph these things. And population ecology, as well as behavioral ecology, are critical disciplines to help us understand how species are doing in their environments. Population genetics is also critically important. We'll look at an explicit example of how genetics affects population growth here in a minute. But folks studying population genetics, here's another close one, right? Is that individual ecology or population ecology? And I wouldn't ask that question and leave you dangling. It's very clear that the genetic variation of the species is studying a mechanism within the individual. That's individual ecology. Genetics is individual ecology. Same way that endocrinology and behavior are individual ecology. But when you then ask that genetic question at the population level, yeah, you're kind of integrating individual ecology with population ecology. So that might be a fair test question. Which two levels of ecology does population genetics integrate? And hopefully you would get population ecology because it's in the name, and hopefully you would remember genetics. That's that reductionistic, narrow stuff. It's in the individual. That's an individual ecological thing to study. Oh, are we locked up already? There we go. Here, I promised you an example of genetics. Maybe you've heard of this example. The Florida panther persists in the panhandle at very low numbers. What happens when you get few numbers? Populations struggle. In particular, if they get small enough that there's not a great deal of genetic variation to mix in the population, then you can get maladaptive evolution. You can get close relatives breeding. This is generally inbreeding not thought of as advantageous. It's not nearly as disadvantageous as the stigma people put on it, but I'm not telling you to go out and marry your cousin. But in very, very small populations, you can get deleterious genes being spread through the population, low levels of genetic variation. This is a problem because if then diseases come around or other challenges come along and the genetic variation in the small population isn't suited to respond to that, then you got nowhere to go. You just have a very small population with some bizarre rare mutants, and if that doesn't do well in the environment, then your species is kind of lost. Behavior gets played into this also because what determines who mates with who? Well, there's a lot of behavioral ecology studying why do some females prefer males that do this? Why do females usually get to choose and males actually compete? In species where males actually choose, what do they choose? What do they prefer in a mate, a female mate? So behavior plays into the population genetics as well. Disease ecology is a discipline that has exploded in the last 20 years in a good way, well, in a bad way, and for a bad reason, but in a good way for disease ecologists. Lots of vectors of disease that we are now concerned about. Birds, primates, you know, whenever the new variant comes out, we wonder, where did it come from? Where did it used to be? Who was the previous host? And how did it spread into our population so widely? When it's birds, we're absolutely out of luck because they're just flying all over the place, spreading viruses and diseases. So understanding migration in bird populations, understanding how natural selection shapes traits. That's an adaptation trait that's favored by and shaped by natural selection. How does the adaptation and natural selection of these viruses lead to forms that are particularly troubling, both for non-human hosts and then eventually for human hosts, if they do come to us. So you can think of diseases just as small pests, and you can take this disease ecology and actually extend it to pest ecology, which is another large discipline, understanding how larger organisms are troubling for humans. And how we might best deter them, slow their growth, or even eliminate them. Forests are being decimated by pests. So this is kind of an extension of pest ecology. Forestry, pest ecology, outbreaks of pests are happening all the time. Ecologists can understand what is so good about, this is all oftentimes the product of invasive species, which is, I think, the very next slide. A pest being brought into a new environment where we don't know how it will do. Sometimes it does very well. Why does it do very well? Well, it all gets down to ecological questions like, what is the phenotype? Whatever that is, it could be the color of the organism, it could be what it feeds on, it could be who it feeds on, it could be who feeds on it. What that organism's suite of traits is like in its environment, and especially in new environments where we don't know how it does. How does it migrate? How is it made up of spatial patchiness? That's what metapopulations means, and we'll talk about that when we get to population ecology. Here you can see kind of a spatial patchiness of the outbreak of a certain forest pest. Ecologists can understand population growth and how it's different in these large populations, which we call sources, and these teeny populations, which we call sinks. But ecologists address all these questions, these applied questions: conservation, pest ecology, disease ecology. This is a big one because our fisheries are collapsing across the world. Probably, if ecology is a depressing discipline, fisheries ecology is some of the most depressing ecology because we are simply not managing our fisheries in ways that support them in the long term. Economically, it's difficult to get a company to behave in a way that makes itself less money in the short term, but more money in the long term. Again, ecologists can study how natural selection is favoring different sized fish that behave differently, populations that grow differently, fish that migrate differently, and then that informs decisions that have to be made by individuals and by governments. How much yield should you take? And ecologists have actual equations to put on the table and say, if you take this much of your yield, you can expect to be a business for about 10 more years. If you will take half of that, you could be a business. Not only could you be a business, but we could continue to eat that food for more like 50 years. So those equations are all there, and ecologists have done that work. But it's another matter of whether or not ecologists are listened to with the science that they produce. Agriculture, it's just fisheries on land. This is, again, could be heavily informed by ecologists. Oftentimes people don't listen. They maximize crop yield. They use chemicals that promote growth and promote yield that oftentimes do not consider the long term. You've heard about crop rotation. This is one of the few things that farmers have ever listened to ecologists about. You've got to rest your soil. If you grow corn in that field for 20 straight years, you may as well move. You might not be able to grow anything in that field for many, many years. So they rotate crops, and this is very effective at supporting soil sustenance. Other things not so much listened to. The chemicals that agriculture uses to deter pests and improve growth are very susceptible to the insects evolving resistance to that. Becomes this vicious cycle where we put more chemicals on our food. That makes food more expensive if you want the food that's not grown with those chemicals. And truthfully, we have not really gotten around many of these pests. These chemicals simply impose natural selection on the pests to find the genetic variation of the pest that doesn't get killed by that pesticide. And then that portion of the population starts growing. So insecticides are a slippery slope. It's a lot of money and a lot of chemical to be spent, and hasn't really been a long-term great solution for agriculture. Maybe some claim the most important variable in biodiversity decline on our planet is not just carbon dioxide and global climate change, it is also the introduction of invasive species. Exotic species, invasive species, you'll hear the term introduced species. These are species that do not have a recent history in that region. Sometimes they're brought there on purpose. Maybe you've heard the hilarious horror stories of governments introducing predators to try to eliminate a pest, and then that predator takes over and starts eating everything, and you would have been better off just leaving things alone. Some huge examples, killer bees, introduced species, kudzu, if anybody's ever lived in the Southeast, kudzu, I was just in North Carolina this past summer, kudzu might take over the world. It's just kind of taking forests and turning them into big pest forests. This is big kudzu vines all over. This is ice plant. Maybe you're more familiar if you go to California coast, walk along the cliffs, you'll see ice plant, which is kind of pretty, but again, is an invasive species that is just exploding in its population growth, changing the community, changing the pollinators, changing the soil structure. A lot of freshwater invasive species. This is really hard because invasive species have to move around, and freshwater mussels, clams, just get encrusted on something. That's why if you have a boat and you're in Michigan, you're going to get stopped at every lake, and they're going to want to inspect your boat before you get in the water, because freshwater species are being introduced species are spreading so rapidly. And it's not like we have anything against these introduced species. It's that they tend to have very negative impacts on the native species. In other words, the community gets unsettled by the introduction of this new guy. Sometimes you introduce a new guy and nobody hears from them again because they don't compete in a new environment. But invasive species, exotic species, the ones that we talk about tend to be species that got introduced, spread like crazy, and are wreaking havoc with the native community. Last one is danger to humans, and this is such a tough thing because everything I just listed, I think, is a danger to humans. You know, it's just a harder sell. Like, you know, is it dangerous to humans that there are really dangerously small populations of Florida panthers? Well, some people might just think, well, I just don't want it to kill me. But is it a danger to humans, to society, if we allow species to go extinct? I think it is. Just a quality of life perspective would suggest that we should try to maintain the ecosystem as close to the way we received it as possible. But there are more obvious examples of ecological issues where there's a danger to humans. And maybe this is actually before some of your time. I don't even remember how long ago this was. You guys remember Sully, the US Airways pilot that was taking off from, I don't know, LaGuardia or New Jersey or somewhere, took some birds into the propellers and went straight down. And it was his heroicness that saved all their lives. They even made a movie about him. Not the most, pervasive example of an ecological issue, but one that really points out the danger to humans. We don't understand why huge flocks of birds are hanging out in an area that we've chosen as an airport. Then we're opening ourselves up to the risk of things like this that presents dangers to humans. Okay, that is the end of chapter 1. You're welcome to hit me with any questions while I switch to share the next screen, which is chapter 2, part 1. So I promised you the levels of ecology, but we're not there yet. Something that the book I work from does is it starts slow, and it starts with kind of more of an introduction to ecology. So this chapter 2 business, I kind of call, not demeaningly, high school ecology. This is probably a review of what you did get fed in high school. Things like biomes, things like, oh, why is a desert a desert? Why is it so cool in San Diego and so hot here? The things that determine the climate of different geographic regions obviously are affecting ecology. The ecology of a tropical rainforest is very different from the ecology of the Sonoran Desert. Yeah, So we'll talk about that in the different levels. But here in the first, in this chapter 2, part 1 and part 2, coming up in the next few days, is a brief review and probably a pretty quick review of the basics of environmental biology, of why certain climates are the way they are. So the first thing we'll start with before we kind of review the biomes is a reminder of why there is any variation on the planet. So the main, so we're going to look at several reasons why there is variability. And variability is the coolest thing in biology. It's not interesting why something is one way, it's interesting why it's different from another way. And that goes for ecosystems as well as individuals, as well as species. Oh, how did that happen? We weren't starting at the beginning, sorry. Okay, so this is the lecture outline. We're going to talk about the biosphere, the climate of the globe. We're going to talk about different biomes, which you could kind of call ecosystems, except it's a bigger scale. It's not just one tropical grassland, it's tropical grasslands in general. And then we'll look at the variation among biomes, and we'll talk about why they're different. Okay, so there are a number of reasons why there's this variation in climate across the globe. And we're going to cover all 4 of these with a couple of slides. And the first has to do with climate. Climate is essentially a lot of things, but it's temperature and precipitation largely. Why is there is variation in temperature? You probably know that. We suffer from that. We live in a hot climate. Why are some climates cold? The main explanation for why there's variation in temperature is and I don't mean daily temperature, right? So our Earth is spinning on its axis, 1 revolution per day. That gives us night and day. That's facing the sun and turning away from the sun. But the bigger factor here is seasonal variation. And seasonal variation in temperature comes not because of the spinning of Earth, but instead because the Earth revolving around the sun. That's where we get the seasons from. Interestingly, we are on a tilt. I don't know if you feel tilted. Do you feel 23.5 degrees tilted? We are tilted such that we get a very unique combination of variation across the seasons. Okay, so here's our sun and here's our Earth. And you can, if you have your slide in front of you, the northern hemisphere is tilting away from the sun. This is what makes it winter. Our winter is not just arbitrarily, January, February, March, because that's not the winter for the southern hemisphere, is it? The northern hemisphere gets its winter in the season when it is tilted away from the sun. Jump half a year here, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, immediately variation in temperature. And latitudinal variation in temperature. Remember, latitude is the up and down, longitude is the out and out. Latitude, going from the equator to the poles, is very affected by this. When you notice, throughout the year, the equator is kind of evenly pushed right at the sun. It's the middle of the Earth, right? So we're going to see the climate of equatorial regions is very static. It's warm all the time. You knew that if you've been to South America, Central America, Central Africa. These are areas that are very constantly warm because we're in this tilt and they are right along the equator. And you can see those different things to the poles. Right here, you can see, you ever been to Alaska? It's like always dark. Why is it always dark? Not always, but why is there darkness in Alaska? Well, look how we are tilted away from the sun. That tilt has a huge effect on our climate. The intensity of solar radiation varies because of it, and the length of the day depends on the seasonality and this tilt. That's temperature. Perhaps equally important, that tilt leads to variation in precipitation. Temperature and precipitation, the 2 big factors of climate. rainfall is varying with the same latitude for a related reason. We're going to describe three cells that create rainfall and variation in rainfall. They're going to be called the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell. And they're going to explain why some areas get more rain than others. Start with the Hadley cell. We're going to start at the equator. The Hadley cell is the cell that explains why tropical rainforests at the equator are very humid, very laden with rainfall. Almost so much that it's hard for plants to grow because it's constantly wet in tropical rainforests. Why is it constantly wet in tropical rainforests at 0 degrees of latitude? The answer is, remember how it was pointing towards the sun? It's always warm there. We'll see some climate diagrams that prove this. It never changes, constantly warm. In fact, some people say there's more variation from day to night in temperature than there is variation in temperature from January to March to April to May to June. Seasonal variation is nil. This means it's always warm there. That warming, that sun heating air at the equator heats air up. That moist air rises, right? It's warm, it's wet. That moist air rises at the equator. As it rises, it cools. So we're starting what's called a cycle. The cycle then is that warm equatorial Earth, moist air rises. When moist air rises, it cools. Cool air can't hold the same water vapor. It just dumps rain right back down. Warm the equator, air rises, dump the rain right back down. Constant heat from the sun, plenty of moisture. It's just a constant loop of warming the equatorial Earth, raining on it. So that explains why the equator is tropical and humid and full of rain. But that's not the Hadley cell. The Hadley cell starts there, and then it continues when you think the dry air that's rising at the equator and then dumping more rain down over and over and over again. Some of that dry air that drops rain spreads away from the equator. It's up high. While that rain happens, that dry air spreads away from the equator. It goes both north and south. So the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell happen both north of the equator and south of the equator in similar ways. The air that is spreading away from the equator continues to cool. It gets heavier and heavier, and roughly 30 degrees north and south, it sinks back to Earth. Sinks back to Earth. Once it hits the Earth, either it continues the Hadley cycle, the Hadley cell, and goes back to the equator, and that gives you the Hadley cell. Rain, dry air out to 30 degrees, back down, and then back to the equator. That's the Hadley cell. The whole process starts over again. What's interesting is that this air that comes down roughly at 30 degrees is all ready to suck up moisture. It's dry, cooler air, and when it hits the ground at 30 degrees, whether it goes back to the equator or towards the poles, it sucks up all the moisture. This explains, and this starts the next cell, the Ferrel cell, and this explains why we have deserts at roughly 30 degrees, north and south of the equator. Deserts occur where the Hadley cell sends this air down and the air sucks up all the moisture. Deserts are dry areas. They're dry for multiple reasons. We'll talk about multiple reasons. One is the generation of this dry air from the Hadley cell. Ferrel cell is created by this Hadley cell that brings air around, but some of the air doesn't go back to the equator. Some of the air heads back out north or south, whichever hemisphere you're in, towards the temperate regions. So the Ferrel cell is named after Will Ferrell, but I think it's a different one. is cool, heavy air sinking from the Hadley cell that doesn't return to the equator, but instead disperses away from the equator, starting a cell that goes from 30 degrees out to 60 degrees. Sorry, that's not shown in that figure, but you can see it a little bit in this figure. Here is the equator. Here is 30 degrees. The ferrule cell, which we're pointing to right here, is the cell started at 30 degrees that heads to 60 degrees and creates another loop. So you know the generation of the ferrule cell. That air mass picks up moisture, again, creating dry desert climates in the region of 30 degrees. As it moves away from desert areas, accumulating moisture, it then meets cold air that's actually coming from the poles and starts getting shoved up into the atmosphere again. So at 60 degrees, we have air rising again, some rain coming down. That's why temperate forests can persist at around 60 degrees. They're not as wet as the equator, and that's again because of the tilt. But still, there's enough rainfall in temperate regions because of the ferrule cell looping around here and coming up and raining back down on 60 degrees. Some of that air cycles back here and starts all over again. Some of that air heads out to the poles, creating a third cell called the polar cell. 3 cells, Hadley, ferrule, and polar, moving from the equator to the poles, that explain why it's really moist at the equator, really dry at 30 degrees, moist again at 60 degrees. And then on the poles, when we think of the cold weather at the poles, there's a lot of moisture there. For similar reasons here, it's just the temperature is different at poles. So that the high level of moisture oftentimes is locked up in the solid form. Okay, so one explanation for seasonal variation in temperature and precipitation, it all comes back to the tilting of the Earth. The precipitation is then explained by these 3 cells. Here's the polar cell. Not a lot to cover there. That's any different. So if that were the case, we should be able to go to an exact spot at 30 degrees and find a desert. But it doesn't turn out to be quite that perfect. And that's because there are other factors that affect climate, not just temperature and precipitation, but also wind. Wind patterns affect the climate. The Coriolis effect in particular, maybe one that you've heard of. They told me that my toilet bowl would go backwards when I was in Australia. That isn't actually true. This is a real phenomenon that makes objects deflected to the left of travel in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so you remember that air that was coming up here and it was going back down here, and then it was starting to come back in the Hadley cell? Well, that air in the southern hemisphere is deflected to the left. Opposite for the northern hemisphere. Remember that Hadley cell, air comes up, comes over, comes down to make dry deserts, and as it's returning, it doesn't go straight. The Coriolis effect deflects it in the northern hemisphere to the right, and in the southern hemisphere to the left. This is not a class where I'm going to claim to understand the Coriolis effect. It's an ecology class where we're interested in the ramifications of something as pervasive as this. And one of the ramifications is that the wind and that drying of that wind is not as predictable as it would have been otherwise. Instead, this deflection is creating some variation in where you find deserts, where you find drier climates. So an interaction between the Hadley cell and the Coriolis effect leads to these wind patterns, creating deserts in places that you might not otherwise would have expected a desert. So if the quiz question was, what, give me a reason why deserts tend to be found near 30 degrees, hopefully you would be able to start with, well, the Hadley cell starts things off, makes things dry. You've got the ferrule cell moving air also that creates dry areas right around 30 degrees. 2 reasons why this is not exactly the case. Well, the Coriolis effect shoves the wind in different directions, according to the Coriolis effect. What's another reason why deserts don't conform to this idea of 30 degrees exactly? Well, one is that temperature is also affected by elevation or altitude. So this is called adiabatic cooling. Again, this is not a meteorology class or a chemistry class where we're going to get into this very deeply, but we all kind of know, it's 20 degrees cooler in Flagstaff than it is in Phoenix, almost to the dime. Check your phone. 80 degrees in Flagstaff today. It's 100 degrees here. Isn't that amazing how it's like almost always 20 degrees difference? We know why. It's not because of the geography, right? It's just 2 hours north of us. It's not because of latitude, right? Why isn't Flagstaff a desert? Why isn't it as much of a desert as Phoenix? Altitude and the cooling of increasing elevation has a big effect on our ecosystems. And if you do the math, this is pretty remarkable. The estimate is that you get about 1 degree Celsius per 100 meters. Guess what? Flagstaff is 2,000 meters higher than Phoenix. 2,000 meters, 1 degree per 100 meters. That's exactly predicting that Flagstaff should be 20 degrees cooler than us at this elevation. It's kind of deceiving when math is that exact, but it's kind of reinforcing as well. So this is all about temperature and pressure. Again, I'm not going to, this is not a class about the physics or the chemistry of this. This is an ecology course noting that these high elevation ecosystems are much cooler and their precipitation patterns are going to be shown to be different as well. So Minnesota and Phoenix, that's latitudinal variation, right? Minnesota is cold because of there being, I don't know, 60, 75 degrees north of the equator. But Flagstaff and Phoenix differences are due to altitudinal variation rather than latitudinal variation. Okay, another third factor that affects global climate is continental distribution. I think it's easy to just summarize this one as the maritime effect. The maritime effect is the notion that when an ecosystem is associated with water, it's actually going to be moderated. It's not going to pick up heat as quickly. It's not going to lose heat as quickly. Look at these two areas, Washington State, coastal Washington State, and Minnesota. Great deal of maritime effect here. This is a very cold place. So look at the moderating effect, the moderating temperature effect, because of the maritime effect in Washington State. This makes it very desirable to live on the coast. Been to San Diego lately, it's like 78 degrees every single day in San Diego. I don't know how they do it. The moderating effect of the maritime effect, the moderating effect of being near large bodies of water, and it is true that oceans are going to do this more than the Great Lakes. That makes it much harder for an ecosystem to pick up heat and much harder for it to lose heat. They change, they do have seasonality, but not as dramatically and not as quickly as more landlocked areas, areas that freeze all the time. Okay, this is our fourth effect on global climate. And it is also regarding mountains, but now we're not featuring the elevation and the temperature change of the elevation, but instead, what do mountains do to precipitation? Mountains do the same thing to precipitation that the Hadley cell does to precipitation. Remember that warm cell at the equator, raining like crazy, and then air leaving the Hadley cell and coming down and being very dry air that picks up all the moisture at 30 degrees. That is a global cycle. The orogenic precipitation, the effect of mountains generally, is that the windward side of mountains, say the coastal side, is very tropical. Again, if you've driven to San Diego, it's a hot desert until you get over that last mountain range. And then all of a sudden, that's when it starts feeling like 76 degrees. It rains more. This is like a tropical paradise, wet, much cooler. But then when that air goes over the mountain, it's dry now, starts coming down, it's all ready to suck up the moisture. So Washington State, the western side of the mountain is a tropical rainforest. The eastern side, people don't talk about as much. It's much cheaper to live in eastern Washington than it is in western Washington. This is a tropical rainforest because of the orogenic precipitation that the West Coast gets. But just on the other side of that large mountain range, it's becomes exceedingly dry. So this is also called the rain shadow effect. You're in the shadow of the rain. On the windward side, you get all this rain, but the shadow of the mountain over here is an incredibly dry set of ecosystems. Okay, so we went through 4 reasons that global climates vary. Solar radiation and the seasonality of precipitation and temperature, the altitude, continental effects and the maritime moderating effect, and then mountains and the precipitation that they generate on their windward sides. We'll use all 4 of these to explain environments, explain the ecosystems, the biomes that we are going to review. And one thing to keep in mind is that all of these biomes, I'm going to use biomes and ecosystems relatively interchangeably, are all driven by both this climate, the environment that their playing field is given, but also on their vegetation. Right? We would not have animals without plants. We would not have life without plants. So the vegetation that a different environment has, a different biome has, is oftentimes used to describe the biome. And you probably heard of creosote flats. This is a type of ecosystem in the Sonoran Desert, totally characterized by the plant creosote, which dominates the flat areas. Okay, so plants are important. So we're going to hit deserts later on, but let's go ahead and make sure it's clear, why do we live in a desert? Everybody talks about the heat. When they say it's a dry heat, well, guess what? That kind of nicely reflects what does a desert mean? It's the interaction of precipitation and temperature. It's the lack of precipitation and the presence of high temperatures. In fact, these climate diagrams, which you'll see a number of, and you should understand and be able to work with on quizzes and stuff, tell you about the temperature, that's the red line, and the precipitation. And that's the, I'm guessing, blue, kind of colorblind. This is Yuma, Arizona right here. You know you're in a desert when through the whole month, January to December, your red temperature line lies above your blue precipitation line. Hotter than it is wet. That's what a desert is. Lots of cool things to learn here. It also tells you the elevation, right? Pretty low, 65 meters. This red line through all months tells you all months have average low temperatures that are above freezing. Okay, that tells you that it almost never freezes, which is largely true of the desert. What else can we learn? This middle area is shaded gold, just telling you this is a hot desert. And the temperature scale begins at 0 degrees, especially in warm climates. Okay, so those are climate diagrams, and they'll tell us a lot. Why do we live in a desert? Well, it's a double whammy. The first is 30 degrees. The Hadley cell, Hadley and Farrell cell, it says Farrell cell. Remember, it's a combination. It's that air from the Hadley cell coming down at 30 degrees and picking up all the moisture, both north and south of the desert. Doesn't have to be precisely on 30 degrees. In that region, the air started by the Hadley cell is going to suck up all the moisture. Okay, and if you look at a global map, where are the deserts? Roughly the equator. The deserts are largely in the region, in the area of 30 degrees. Not precisely. We'll talk about why there's that variation. So the Hadley and Farrell cell explain the dry ecosystem a little bit. But there's a second whammy to the double whammy, and that is orogenic precipitation. The Sierra Nevadas, the buffer of mountains along the West Coast, produces this ecosystem, this shift where things are wet on the west side and dry on the east side. We are in that. You have to think at big scale, right? It's not just like 5 meters over the mountain. That air is coming over the Sierra Nevadas and sweeping through, and it's just drying out everything. Drying out Vegas, drying out Albuquerque, it's drying out Phoenix, some places more than others. But that orogenic precipitation, that rain shadow effect, is a big driver of the dry conditions here. If the winds came from the other direction, we'd have a completely different ecosystem. I wonder if we can manufacture that somehow. Get the winds to switch so that we are the tropical wet area and the other side of the mountains on the West Coast is dry. That would probably be a bad experiment to try. Okay, so we have a number of ecosystems or biomes to talk about. We're going to talk about where it's located, what its structure is, and again, plants, structure, and ecosystem. They determine what kind of animals can live there. We'll talk about challenges that it poses for organisms. Is it really dry? Is it really hot? By the way, we will have a chapter following this where we talk about aquatic ecosystems, but right now biomes refers to terrestrial ecosystems. And we'll talk about how humans are impacting that biome. So here's a grid to know what to expect in the biomes lectures. We're going to go from the equator, the tropical rainforests, to the poles and the tundra, with the temperate stuff in the middle and the deserts, and 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees. And in each one, we're going to talk about, and I wouldn't expect you to get all of your notes in these boxes, but it just gives you kind of a layout. Where do you find this biome? What's its climate like? What's the soil and the plant life like? What's the biology like? And what are the human impacts on that ecosystem? We'll get a couple started here. The tropical rainforest. You might have been to a tropical rainforest. Anybody born in a tropical rainforest? Everybody from Phoenix? Where are you from? Brazil. Brazil. Oh, well, I'm glad to know that before I start really bashing Brazilian government decisions about how they handle tropical rainforests. But I hear it's a beautiful country. I've been to Peru and the Amazon in Peru, which is a similar ecosystem, and wow. It just feels like another country. I guess it is. It's another world. Just I felt the same way in Africa. It's like the air feels different. The biome is very, very different. And what is that all about? It's about a very constant warm temperature. Look at this. This is almost a perfect straight line across the season. The temperature never changes. And actually, a lot of precipitation and not that much variation in precipitation. You might point out this dip, but in general, this is not like there's no rainy season in Zaire, which I think actually has changed its name. Some old figures here. I apologize if your favorite country is still called something old. They get 20 times as much rain as we get. There's some variation in these biomes, right? So tropical rainforests straddle the equator in 3 major regions. Yours, Africa, and Asia. And they are actually, interestingly, also the most biodiverse regions in the world. So it's a very interesting and unresolved question. Why are there so many freaking species in the tropical rainforests? A lot more species in the tropical rainforest than there are an equal amount of space in a desert or a temperate forest or a polar region. What is it about tropical rainforests that makes so many species persist there? It's an interesting question. We can put some hypotheses out there, but it's not really well understood yet. So these are biodiverse areas. They are areas typified in their climate by a lack of temperature variation. And again, I said in a lot of places, the daily variation is equal to the yearly variation. I mean, what yearly variation? Right? It's like 28, 27 degrees Celsius all year long. That's a lot of people like that. It's worth noting that and the lack of precipitation actually can cause problems for the biology. Also, a great deal of precipitation. Some places, not a lot of variation. Other places, some pronounced dips. And it's an interesting question to ask. Why are some tropical rainforests wetter than others? And it's actually worth noting that this one is wetter than this one, right? It just has one season, 1 month when precipitation drops off, but otherwise it's up near 300 millimeters, which is more than here. So there's variation in tropical rainforests, not so much in temperature, but a little bit in precipitation patterns. But always precipitation is going to be higher than this temperature line, always. So could you explain, and here's the thing, you don't need the right answer. Ecology is so complicated that right answers are pretty rare. So I like that about it. This is not, a math class where, 3.19 is the right answer. Ecology is so complicated that we really strive to understand patterns and be able to make predictions, because we can almost never arrive at the right answer, which is a little bit frustrating for a scientist. But, what are some reasons why this is wetter, but has a little bit of patchiness in the precipitation? You might say, well, maybe it's because it's lower. It's at 24 meters, and this one's at 415 meters. Maybe, but this one's even higher. Oh, yeah, no, this one's at 27 meters. This one's also low, but it doesn't have that dip. So there are hypotheses there, but you generally know the 4 reasons there's variation: mountains and orogenic precipitation, elevation, adiabatic cooling, wind patterns, and then the seasonal variation that comes from climate, from our travel around the sun. Okay, what's the biology like in tropical rainforests? Make this the last slide. We think of tropical rainforests as being dominated by these trees, but in fact, the soils are really, really poor. And they're poor because they're just inundated with water. It's so warm constantly, so moist constantly, that everything decomposes rapidly. The massive rainfall just takes every good thing out of the soil, and most of the resources are locked up in this canopy. That canopy is deciduous and drops leaves to the floor again, and that kind of sustains the soil, but the soil is overrun with decomposition. The massive decomposition, because of temperature and because of rainfall, makes tropical rainforests actually quite poor, which makes you wonder, well, then why are there so many species there? And we brought up a couple ideas for that. We'll pick up next time at the end of tropical rainforests and try to motor through the rest of the biomes. I think we'll succeed in doing that. So be ready for the rest of the biomes and maybe even the start of the aquatic biomes, aquatic ecosystems next time, Thursday.